ocean liner, the largest in the world, sets out from Southampton on a spring day in 1912 on her maiden voyage. 4 days later, in the middle of the North Atlantic, she strikes an iceberg and goes down, killing 1,500 people. The ship didn't have enough lifeboats for all aboard. I just told you the basic story of the RMS Titanic in 51 words, one of the most well-known stories in recent history. You probably already know it, or you wouldn't have clicked on this video. But here is a question that I wonder if you have ever considered. What does it mean? Why is it important? Is it important, or is it just a curiosity of the past, a sort of plaything in history? Fun and fascinating to read about and to revisit again and again, to experience and re-experience through books, movies, videos, all sorts of media. But what does it mean? Can the Titanic disaster be said to mean anything, besides the obvious logistical lesson, which is, if you're going to put people to sea on an ocean liner, you better make sure you have enough lifeboats for everybody. And also, maybe you don't want to go charging into an ice field at high speed. That's not what I mean when I ask the question, what does the Titanic disaster mean? I'm Sean Munger. I'm a historian, author, and teacher. It's been a while since I uploaded a video to this channel, and the topic of this video is, simply put, the meaning of the Titanic. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. Yes, this is a long video, the better part of 2 hours. This is an experiment, first time I'm doing this kind of thing on my channel. It might be an outlier, I might not ever do one again, or I might do more long-form subjects if this one is successful. I suggest that you use, I don't expect everyone to go through all of this long video from beginning to end. What I suggest you do is that you use chapters as a way to navigate this video. I've tried to label them pretty clearly and succinctly so you can find your way around if you choose not to watch straight through. This introductory chapter is the summary. As in-depth as I want to get in this subject, I don't want to waste your time. So let me lay my cards on the table. I'm going to state my basic thesis right here up front, and then I will spend the rest of the video elaborating it, elucidating it, kind of talking around it, and hopefully proving it, or at least making an arguable case. So here's the basic thesis. The Titanic disaster of April 1912 was one of the most important episodes that occurred shortly before the outbreak of the First World War, which, if read in the right way, was a clue to the fundamental social, political, and cultural instability of the Western world at that time, an instability which broke wide open catastrophically when the war swept away most of the world order. The operative metaphor here is that the Titanic was sort of like a foreshock that preceded a major earthquake. I'm going to introduce a term here, which I will also explain in due course and at considerable length, and the term is this: quiver. A quiver, as I mean that term, is an event that discloses unexpected weakness or potential breakdown in a system or an institution that was previously assumed to be indefinitely stable. The Titanic disaster was a quiver, foreshadowing the catastrophic earthquake that blew up the world in July and August of 1914. That was the breakdown of the system. The Titanic was an event that disclosed unexpected weakness in various systems of Western thought and culture as it existed in the years just before World War I. It was not the only such quiver. In fact, I will identify a number of others, but that's the basic concept. And we'll spend the rest of the video, yes, all hour, 45 minutes or whatever of it, in proximity at least to this concept. So in this video, I'm going to discuss a lot of stuff. The Titanic disaster, obviously, and various accounts or aspects of the history of the disaster. Of course, I'm going to be talking about that. But as in-depth as I plan to get, this is not intended as a comprehensive account of every aspect of the Titanic. Instead, we're going to visit subjects that might seem at first glance pretty far afield. For example, we're going to be talking about World War I, obviously, but also the Industrial Revolution, the Crystal Palace Exposition of 1851, John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia in 1859, the Panic of 1907, the Russian Revolution of 1905, a groundbreaking symphony by Stravinsky, and an obscure painter from Berlin that was eerily ahead of his time. I'll also be talking about some subjects that come after the Titanic in history, such as the bombing of Hiroshima in World War II, climate change, Brexit. I'll give a brief mention to the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine, and a lot more. At this point, you may be asking yourself, what does any of this possibly have to do with the Titanic? I mean, come on, Brexit? How is Brexit related to the Titanic? It is, or at least it may be, if I'm successful at making my case. So I'm just giving you fair warning of where we're going. Again, if you feel lost, use the chapters in this video as a guide. Another warning, I'm going to assume that you know something about the Titanic already, at least basics. On the level of, I assume you know the basic facts of how the disaster occurred and unfolded. I assume you know who Captain E.J. Smith and John Jacob Astor were. I assume you know that the principal cause of the huge loss of life was that existing lifeboat regulations in 1912 did not specify that there had to be enough lifeboat space for all people aboard. If you don't know the basics of the subject, still the best entry-level book is the classic and the one that hooked generations of Titanic buffs since it first came out in 1956, Walter Lord's A Night to Remember. Highly recommended. Sometimes the old standbys really are the best. So if you're ready to delve into the meaning of the Titanic, let's get started. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I know you're probably eager to get past the conceptual stuff, but it's worth mentioning that most historians don't really think the Titanic means much of anything. The way history is usually done as a profession, very little broader meaning is ever attached to this event. It's just sort of something that happened within the context of a larger era. I'm speaking of professional historians here. Now, libraries full of books have been written on the Titanic and various aspects of it, but the vast majority of those books have been for popular audiences, not historians. You couldn't go to Harvard University's graduate history department, for example, and find a professor whose primary field of study is the Titanic. There's no professional historical discipline called Titanic studies. The field just doesn't work that way. Now, that's not to say that a professional historian might not study this event as kind of a lens to look at something else. For example, somebody might write a paper on the behavior of women during the Titanic disaster, how they reacted to the emergency, did their behavior break down along class lines, wealthy women who got on the lifeboats versus steerage women who were left behind, that sort of thing, something like that. But that would be using the disaster to look at a broader phenomenon. Somebody who would publish a paper like that would probably be a historian studying women in the Victorian and Edwardian eras. That wouldn't really make them a Titanic scholar in the same way that you might, for example, describe Harvard professor Annette Gordon-Reed as a scholar of African American women in the early Republic, or Bill Cronin as an environmental historian. So that's what I mean by that. So why is this? Because through the lens of what professional historians do, it's really hard to connect the Titanic disaster to a broader historical picture. Sure, it led to overhauls of safety measures on ships and sparked creation of the International Ice Patrol, but it's kind of hard to find a direct historical consequence other than that. And honestly, International Ice Patrol is sort of weak sauce when it comes to historical importance. When I was working on my PhD, I TA'd, TA means teaching assistant, I TA'd for various professors who were teaching survey courses in both European and American history, all of which covered this period, early 20th century, in one way or another. The Titanic disaster was not even mentioned in the curriculum in a single one of these courses, so far as I can remember. Now, let me give you a counterexample. In October 1859, radical abolitionist John Brown led a daring raid on the armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, hoping to steal a bunch of weapons and encourage a slave uprising that would bring on the Civil War that he believed correctly was coming. Brown was captured, put on trial, and executed, and the incident got huge press all over America. Everybody was talking about it. At least as well publicized as the Titanic disaster would be 53 years later. John Brown's raid killed 10 people, not counting Brown himself, sort of an indirect casualty. But the John Brown raid of 1859 is mentioned in every significant account of the coming of the U.S. Civil War. You couldn't tell the story of how the war started without mentioning it. Historians have written biographies of Brown and monographs about what the raid meant and how it channeled and reflected public opinions about slavery and disunion. I just covered the John Brown incident in a class I taught this spring on the history of the American West. So historians think about the meaning of John Brown. Historians don't think very much about the meaning of the Titanic disaster. Point taken, I hope. Let's move on and we'll talk about industrialization and technology. One of the reasons the Titanic disaster was such a shock in 1912 was, simply put, it was built up in popular consciousness in Britain and the United States as a paragon of modern industrial technology, for complicated reasons that I'll get into. In 1912, there was sort of a cult surrounding industrial technology, a faith that it exemplified above all things, progress with a capital P. The fact that Titanic sank on its maiden voyage, first time out of the gate, builds up the central contradiction of the story that we find so interesting. This is a story of hubris. The word unsinkable finds its way into every retelling of the disaster. In fact, the event loses much of its emotional and psychological interest if you don't stress that aspect of it. The traditional story is that Titanic was conceived over a dinner party at a mansion called Downshire House, which fronted Berkeley Square in London. The party is said to have occurred on April 30th, 1907. And it was between J. Bruce Ismay, chairman of the White Star Line, and Lord William Peary, the managing director of the shipbuilding firm Harland & Wolff. In 1907, White Star was locked in fierce competition with its commercial arch-rival, the Cunard Line, whose sister ships Lusitania and Mauretania were capturing headlines and prestige as the fastest liners on the Atlantic. Olympic and Titanic would be bigger, at least 50% bigger than Lusitania, and while not as fast, they would be even more luxurious. White Star intended to compete with Cunard not on the battlefield of speed, but luxury and prestige. Now, let's unpack this a moment. There's a lot of levels to this. What precisely were Ismay and Peary aiming for? Engineering and prestige superiority, sure, but the White Star Line was a money-making operation, and the quest for greater profits was of urgency, personal urgency, especially to Ismay. Now, this is because he was the son of the founder of the White Star Line, Thomas Ismay. He died in 1899. 3 years later, in 1902, Ismay negotiated a business deal whereby the White Star Line was bought by a large trust called IMM, International Mercantile Marine, which was owned by American millionaire J.P. Morgan. He shows up in our story later on. Ismay was initially reluctant to get into bed with Morgan, who I stress was American, not British, but Morgan was a pretty insatiable businessman, and if he wanted something, he usually got it. In fact, the whole point of IMM was to monopolize, and I mean literally monopolize, North Atlantic shipping. White Star was a strategic asset of IMM and Morgan. Once doing their bidding, commercially speaking, Ismay now had to turn even greater profits over to his masters. Luxury and engineering prowess were marketing tools. They were means to an end, the end, of course, being profit. The irony here is that there was money to be made in the North Atlantic passenger trade, but bidding for luxury passengers wasn't really the main profit center. It was steerage, or third class, where the big bucks came from. In the 19-teens, vast numbers of immigrants were leaving Europe and traveling to the United States. Their tickets were cheap, and their accommodations were pretty chintzy and basic, even on Titanic, but that was where IMM's real passenger profits came from. Olympic and Titanic would be bigger than Lusitania or Mauretania, but that extra size, it didn't end up being anything close to 50%, by the way, but that extra size would be put mostly to use hauling those steerage passengers. Luxury, speed, and engineering prestige were the three axes of marketing North Atlantic liners in the early 19-teens. Of these three, speed was probably the most important, and Cunard had a lock on that one. And also, they pretty much owned the other two. White Star had to give up on speed, but they doubled down on the other two in hopes of drawing passengers away from Cunard. Now, this business decision set up a lot of reasons why the Titanic story would eventually resonate. So think about this. What if it had been Mauretania, which was the fastest ship in the world in 1912 that struck an iceberg and sank? I don't think a disaster like that would have had anything like the same cultural resonance as the one that actually happened. First of all, it wasn't a maiden voyage disaster. Mauretania had been sailing for almost 5 years. Titanic had never been out of the gate before. Second, it just wouldn't strike you the same way. Titanic is a story about hubris, not because it was the fastest liner, but because it was the biggest and the most luxurious, and especially because it was believed to be the safest. But the safety, that was more marketing than substance. Thomas Andrews, the builder of Titanic, never designed her to be quote-unquote unsinkable, and he never made that claim explicitly. Maximum safety was not a design parameter. Obviously. Titanic got the reputation as being exceptionally safe, not because she was designed to be. She wasn't. She got that reputation because Ismay was competing with Cunard on engineering prestige. And in this world of industrial superlatives, where bigger is always better, it was very easy to impress on the public's mind that if Titanic was the biggest and most impressive ship ever built in terms of engineering advances, it almost went without saying that it also had to be the safest. See how this works. The claims of Titanic being unsinkable, which were a lot more was made of them after the disaster than before, but those claims are universally traceable to marketing, not to design considerations. The most famous and biggest source of the unsinkable claim was a spread in 1911 Shipbuilder magazine, specifically about Olympic, and the wording there was practically unsinkable. It was qualified. White Star Line marketing materials, published while the ships were under construction in 1910, made the claim that, quote, the ships are designed to be unsinkable. Harland and Wolff, the shipbuilding company that constructed Olympic and Titanic in Belfast, Northern Ireland, did not make that claim. That was the White Star Line who made that claim. Ismay, however, he did pump up the idea of the ship being unsinkable, and so did the captain, Edward J. Smith, who said in a press interview before the sailing, he said, quote, I cannot imagine any condition that would cause a ship to founder. Modern shipbuilding has gone beyond that, end quote. This is, in a word, ludicrous. Just 3 years earlier, in January 1909, the White Star liner RMS Republic sank after a collision with another ship. Captain Smith was not in command of the Republic, but he did command most other big White Star liners at one time or another. He knew all about that disaster. So did modern shipbuilding advance just so far in just those 3 years as to make sinkings a thing of the past? No, of course not. It was just hot air to inflate the marketing image of Titanic, which was, at the time he made the statement, selling tickets for its maiden voyage. So we can easily see why White Star's people made or advanced these kinds of claims. The more relevant question is, why did people seem to believe them? Why did the idea of the Titanic being unsinkable or practically unsinkable catch on in the public consciousness? To understand the answer to this, we have to go way back, 60 years before the Titanic disaster. In 1851, there was a great exhibition held in London, one of the first World's Fairs. It was called the Great Exhibition of the Work of Industry of All Nations. It's known more simply as just the Crystal Palace exhibition. And it was called that because of the massive greenhouse-like exhibition hall, almost 2,000 feet long, that was built especially to house it. The Crystal Palace exhibition was the brainchild of Prince Albert, husband of Queen Victoria, and other members of the Royal Society for Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures, and Commerce. It was an answer to a similar but much smaller scale exhibition that had happened in France in 1844. Crystal Palace was meant to showcase industry and technology. Huge engines were on display, gadgets and technologies such as new photographic techniques, a super accurate telescope, and even a precursor of the fax machine. The fair was also meant as a showcase of colonialism. In 1851, the British Empire was at its height, and artifacts and raw materials from all of Britain's colonies were on display at this fair. Those colonies, especially in Africa and parts of Asia, were exploited in part through the use of technology, particularly steamboats. Steam-driven craft could penetrate the interiors of colonial lands, and medicines to combat or prevent malaria, which meant British troops could hold down forts in tropical locations without half or more of them dying of disease, which is what had been common before. Over 6 million people visited the Crystal Palace exhibition during its 5.5-month run. The fair turned a profit sufficient to fund a number of permanent facilities, including the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, which is still around today. Unfortunately, the giant Crystal Palace itself burnt down in 1936, and what you're looking at right now are some of the only remains of it, these famous dinosaur sculptures that were part of the exhibition grounds. The reason this exhibition was important is because it was a major part of sort of a cult around technology that developed, especially in Great Britain in the middle of the 19th century. This was a direct result of industrialization and also of Britain's colonial exploitation around the world. 1851 was around the beginning of what historians call the New Imperialism, which was a rush to grab colonies and resources around the world. The United States got involved in this too, especially at the very end of the 19th century. The Philippines and Hawaii were seized by American forces in 1898. Also, in the U.S., you see this same cult of technology. The Centennial Exposition of 1876 was modeled directly on the Crystal Palace Fair, and it sought to do for the United States what Crystal Palace had done for the British Empire. The point I'm making here is that these exhibitions, and also the colonialist adventures that were going on at the same time, forged in people's minds a vision of technology and engineering as the sine qua non of advanced civilization. Britain and the United States were destined to conquer large portions of the world through the use of, and because they had, technology that was seen as better and more advanced than other countries. This vision of colonialism was, of course, deeply racist and not only ignored the suffering of millions of the world's peoples who were living under colonial domination at the time, but this attitude justified colonialism and excused its excesses. For particularly egregious examples of this kind of thinking, read the works of Rudyard Kipling, whose writings were very popular at the end of the 19th century. You can draw a straight line from the Crystal Palace to the Titanic. One of the architects of the Crystal Palace building was Isambard Kingdom Brunel, the famous British engineer of the 19th century, one of whose many accomplishments in this period was building the first great modern ocean liner, the Great Eastern, which took to sea in 1859 and was the largest ship ever built up until that time, a progenitor of Titanic in many important respects. So hold this thought, the development of a cult of technology, of faith in technology, as a hallmark of and a cause of social and civilizational achievement and superiority. This is going to come up again, but I think I've made my point. The Titanic was built at Harland and Wolff shipyards in Belfast, Northern Ireland. As you recall, H&W was the firm owned by Lord Peary, one of the guests at that dinner party back in 1907, and he was eager to climb on the International Mercantile Marine bandwagon because he knew that the White Star Line would give his firm a steady supply of orders for increasingly large ocean liners. H&W, in fact, had to build a brand new set of slipways to handle the mammoth liners Olympic and Titanic. Construction started on those yards in 1909. Today, they've been preserved as part of a Titanic-themed museum and attraction. You're looking right now at the place where they were built. The shipyard was a major employer in the Belfast area, a gravy train that brought a lot of work to tradesmen and laborers in that city. I find it really interesting that Titanic's identity as a work of Irish construction, built in Ireland principally by Irish, finds its way into James Cameron's 1997 film in two interesting ways. There's a scene early on where an Irish character, friend of Jack Dawson's, remarks that thousands of Irishmen built the Titanic, and also the Irish flavor comes through strongly in the film's musical score by James Horner, who uses a lot of Celtic and Irish musical motifs throughout the whole picture. And of course, there's the character played by Jeanette Goldstein, identified in the credits as Irish Mommy, who in the film is last seen telling a bedtime story to her two young kids after the lifeboats have left. According to a passenger list published by the White Star Line, 113 persons identified as Irish sailed aboard Titanic and boarded at Cobh, or Queenstown. Of those 113, 72 died, including all 5 children, all in third class, who were identified as Irish. The percentage of Irish men who died was over 85%. The survival rate was higher among women. So let's try to put the Titanic's Irishness in historical context. Ireland in 1912 was a powder keg. All of the island of Ireland at that time was part of the United Kingdom, which was proclaimed in 1800 and included the traditional homelands of England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. Irish, particularly Catholic Irish in the South, deeply resented what they perceived as rule by a foreign colonialist power. Numerous revolts broke out against British control, the largest of them in 1798. The roots of how Ireland got this way stretch way back to the Middle Ages. I just went through this with my 8th graders. In a sectarian conflict, Catholic versus Protestant really began to ramp up when Kings Henry VIII and James I heavily encouraged settlement by English Protestant landowners in Ireland. Most of those landowners settled in the north, which is how Northern Ireland developed with a different religious and political character than Southern Ireland. In 1912, and indeed right up until the outbreak of the First World War in July and August 1914, the British Parliament and the political scene was consumed with what was called the Home Rule crisis. Home rule was an idea that was hot in late Victorian times, and it was supposed to be that although Ireland would nominally remain part of the UK, it would have its own parliament and government responsible for its own internal affairs, while the British Parliament would handle imperial matters. There was some support for this idea in the British Parliament, to which Ireland did elect members, I might add. Attempts at enacting Home Rule for Ireland were made unsuccessfully in 1886 and 1893, beaten back mostly by conservative Britons in the House of Lords. Then a sort of mini-constitutional crisis broke out in 1909 and 1910. I won't bore you with all the details, but after 2 general elections in the same year, 1910, basically liberals and conservatives in Parliament were equally matched. 274 seats for liberals, 272 seats for the conservatives after that first 1910 election. So the way the British Parliament works, a party that doesn't have an outright majority must partner with another party to form a coalition government. What was the next biggest party besides the 2 big ones? The Irish Nationalist Party, with 71 seats. The Liberal Party, who held the prime ministership, Henry H. Asquith was prime minister at the time. Anyway, the Liberal Party needed the support of the Irish Nationalists to get anything done in Parliament. Guess how they're going to get that support? By passing a Home Rule bill. On April 11th, 1912, the very day that the Titanic docked at Cobh and those 113 Irish passengers got on, Asquith introduced the Home Rule bill into Parliament. The political crisis over it was already raging. Because of the cultural and sectarian divide in Ireland, Northern Irish, who tended more often to be Protestant, opposed Home Rule. They didn't want to be ruled from Dublin. Translation, they didn't want to be ruled by Catholics from Dublin. There was also a class divide. The north of Ireland was more urbanized, incomes were generally higher, there was more capital there. Home rule by Catholic Irish, Catholics were 75% of the population in the south, rule by Catholic Irish, who tended to be more rural and agrarian, might threaten commercial ties with Britain that would harm Northern Irish more than anyone else. To oppose Home Rule, opponents of it, called Unionists, organized a militia later in 1912, the Ulster Volunteers. Their opposite numbers, usually Catholic, formed an opposing militia, the Irish Volunteers, in 1913. Basically, in the Titanic era, Ireland was already splitting at the seams and civil war was imminent. Political fights in Parliament, the British Parliament, over the Home Rule Bill went on throughout 1913 and 1914. Finally, it was scheduled to become law on September 20th, 1914. But when the UK found itself somewhat unexpectedly drawn into the European War on August 3rd, Asquith's government quickly tabled the issue and made it so that the Home Rule Bill would not come into effect for the duration of the war. World War I further split Ireland. On the day the war started, John Redmond, head of the Irish Nationalist Party, remember that was the key partner in Parliament, anyway, he pledged support of his people for the war effort. Ireland sent tens of thousands of volunteers into the British Army in World War I. This decision was not universally popular. Irish who still resented British rule and thought it was nuts that their people were fighting in their colonizers' army rose up in another rebellion, the Easter Uprising of 1916. That didn't go so well, but it did set the stage for an eventual declaration of independence by Ireland, at least the southern counties, after World War I ended. Long story short, there was a civil war within Ireland in 1922, overlaid on top of a conflict between Irish nationalists and the British. The result was two Irelands, an independent South, that's the Republic of Ireland, and Northern Ireland, Ulster, which remained, and to this day remains, part of the United Kingdom. But even this wasn't the end of the story. Within Northern Ireland itself, Catholics who felt like second-class citizens being abused by a Protestant majority sparked a large civil rights movement in the 1960s, which in 1968 broke into violence and civil unrest. The British sent troops to calm things down, and that touched off 30 years of grinding low-level guerrilla warfare called the Troubles. The principal Irish nationalist force fighting in that war, the Irish Republican Army, was a direct descendant of the Irish Volunteers that were founded in 1913. So why does this story matter, and how on earth is it relevant to the Titanic? Well, look at what the Titanic represents. A major asset, both economically and in cultural and engineering terms, built in Ireland by Irish labor for a British company owned by an American during a political crisis and nascent civil war in Ireland over many issues related to British colonialist rule in Ireland. There's a message there, or at least a kind of a reflection of the broader issues that were going on at the time. I might also add that the sectarian and social conflict in Belfast reached directly into the shipyards at Harland and Wolff. H&W was notorious for being a closed union shop for its workers, and union membership was only available to Protestants. So when Danny, the Irish character in Cameron's Titanic, says Irish hands built this ship, he might as well have said Protestant Irish hands built this ship, which itself would have led an interesting coloration to the identification of the Titanic as a product of Ireland and Irish labor. Let's talk about one of the big elephants in the room surrounding this subject, and that involves the role of gender in the Titanic story. The phrase "women and children first" is universally associated with the Titanic disaster. Curious how it isn't nearly as associated with other maritime disasters of the period, such as the Empress of Ireland, which went down in the St. Lawrence River in 1914, or even the Lusitania sinking of 1915. Anyway, that's an aside. Let's go through the numbers. There were 2,207 people aboard Titanic. That includes passengers and crew. 1,517 died. There were 412 women passengers in all classes, of whom 108 died. There were 22 women crew and staff aboard, of whom only 2 died. Of 776 male passengers in all classes, 648 died. Of 896 male crew and staff, 701 died. Clearly, women survived at a higher statistical rate than men did. However, as with any statistics, these numbers don't tell the whole story. The numbers of dead versus survivors by class, rather than by gender, are quite different. Look at first-class men. Of 159 total, 105, or about two-thirds, survived. 54 died, and that number includes famous volunteers such as Isidor Straus and Benjamin Guggenheim, who probably could have gotten seats on the boats but chose to stay behind. First-class men had a significantly greater survival rate than third-class women, 179 total, of whom 88 got lucky, and 91, just more than half, never made it home. The officers loading some, not all, but some of the lifeboats did clearly predominate selecting women, women with children, or children alone to get into the boats. On the other hand, some selecting officers didn't care. If the rule was applied, it was applied unevenly. Gender pops up in different ways in the Titanic story. At the time, and in most of the traditional retellings, women heroes like the Countess of Rothes, who seized the tiller of a lifeboat, and Margaret Molly Brown, who insisted her boat go back for survivors, both of those were first-class women, they often get a lot of play. Molly Brown was played by Academy Award-winning actress Kathy Bates in the 1997 film and by Debbie Reynolds in the 1964 film The Unsinkable Molly Brown. There are also legends of men dressing in women's clothes in order to get a place in the lifeboats. Right after the disaster, in May 1912, the New York Daily Chronicle published an account of 3 quote-unquote gamblers who supposedly got off the ship by dressing as women. Their true names conveniently were not recorded. This story is almost certainly false. In the early 1980s, a TV series called Voyagers did an episode depicting the sinking of the Titanic, in which White Star Line chairman Bruce Ismay is depicted as dressing in women's clothes to get into a lifeboat, a completely false charge. No true witness to the disaster ever reported that. But note what's going on here with these stories. The women and children first idea is essentially being weaponized. In the desperate circumstances of the disaster, gender roles are supposedly reversed, with women being seen as having a higher status. It's just nonsense, but it reflects that, yes, unfortunately, gender politics are at work even in the Titanic disaster and its aftermath. In reality, not dissimilar to the Ireland situation that we just talked about, gender issues were red hot in both Britain and the United States in 1912. The Titanic disaster occurred at the height of campaigns for women's suffrage in both countries. Molly Brown was a strong supporter of women's suffrage in the United States. The Countess of Rothes, though conservative in almost every other aspect of her politics, was also a suffragist. Women did not have the vote in either country in 1912, though very long movements had been active in both countries to secure the vote. Though the vast majority of women's rights organizations were organized for political pressure and civil disobedience, in Britain, a radical organization called the Women's Social and Political Union began a campaign of bombings and terrorist attacks in June of 1912, 2 months after the disaster. In July 1912, members of the WPSU threw a bomb into a theater where Prime Minister H.H. Asquith was watching a play. Earlier that same day, one of the group threw a hatchet at his head. In 1913, the WPSU started sending letter bombs to prominent politicians. They also burnt down various structures and set bombs in some other places, many of which failed to go off. The WPSU called off its terrorist campaign at the outbreak of World War I. Much more common and mainstream tactics involved protests and sit-ins, harassing politicians with uncomfortable questions, hunger strikes, and other forms of civil disobedience. There was crossover between the women's suffrage movements in the U.S. and in Britain. One important woman who traveled between these countries, cross-pollinating ideas and political connections, was Alice Paul, who helped organize a massive march on Washington, D.C. the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration in March 1913. 500,000 people attended this march, and it's been credited with getting the momentum going for the final push needed to get the 19th Amendment over the finish line in 1920, although World War I interrupted that momentum for a time. Alice Paul, incidentally, went on to write the Equal Rights Amendment and worked tirelessly for its passage. That fight was still going on at the time of her death in 1977. The ERA came within one state of ratification before it expired in 1982, and it's in fact referred to as the Alice Paul Amendment. Again, what does this have to do with the Titanic, other than the serendipity of timing? Well, it's no coincidence that the final and ultimately decisive pushes to secure women's voting rights were gearing up in both Britain and the US at the time of the disaster. Both would ultimately be successful. British women got the vote in 1918. Women were becoming empowered in significantly new ways in this period, in part thanks to industrialization and the changes it was having in work and economic life, and in part because political privilege was starting to crumble in the major democracies. And yet still, significant barriers to progress existed. The Titanic and its rigid class structure reflected those barriers. If you were more likely to get a seat on a lifeboat if you were wearing a tuxedo than if you had on a poor woman's dress, you can see that this was a period of unequal progress and hotly contested issues. I'm sorry, I think these issues matter. If we talk about gender on the Titanic, we have to talk about race and ethnicity. And if we talk about race and ethnicity in 1912, we have to talk about colonialism. I've already touched on this a little bit, specifically in the case of Ireland. But to understand the true meaning of the disaster, we have to go deeper than that. The Titanic was an ark of humanity. Despite being built in Ireland and operated from Britain and headed to the United States, the passengers were not all British, Irish, and Americans. Increasing attention has been paid in recent years to the ethnic and global dimensions of the Titanic's passengers and crew. In addition to citizens of the UK and the United States, people from 25 other countries were represented among the passengers, and that doesn't count people from 9 other places that are today independent countries but were not in 1912. For example, Poland and the Baltic states like Estonia, Lithuania, etc., which were then ruled by Russia, or various provinces of the Austro-Hungarian or Ottoman empires. I'm going to talk about the Ottomans in a minute. It's become much more well known in relatively recent times that Chinese sailed aboard the Titanic. Indeed, there were 8 passengers from Hong Kong, which was then a British colony. 6 survived. In 2021, those 6 Chinese survivors were the focus of a documentary simply called The Six, which shone a light on their lives and families. Many of them didn't talk about their experiences in the disaster for decades afterward. Anti-Asian racism was rampant in 1912, and this is part of why the Chinese survivors rarely spoke up. A Brooklyn newspaper, for example, right after the disaster ran a completely erroneous story a few days after the sinking, which claimed quote-unquote Chinese coolies had stowed away aboard a lifeboat by hiding under the plank seats, and 2 were supposedly crushed to death when women got into the boat. The Chinese having hidden there surreptitiously, as the article said, the first sign of danger. This story is absolutely false and reflects the virulently racist attitudes toward Asians that were common in 1912. Note how this story functions similarly to the claims of people putting on women's clothes to get a seat in the lifeboat. Here, the transgression is racialized instead of gender-oriented, but it's a slur just the same. To his credit, James Cameron, when he made the 1997 movie, included one of the Chinese passengers, Fong Long, who is seen early in the film walking down a corridor. In a scene that was deleted from the theatrical version, Fong appears again at the very end as one of the few survivors fished from the water on floating wreckage after the ship has gone down, perched up on a door on all 4s. Now, the Rose character is correct in this part of the movie when she says that only a handful of people were rescued by a single boat that came back. In the film, she says 6 were saved. The sources I looked at said 4. Fong Long was one of those 4, which means that his survival was one of the most astronomically lucky ones in the entire disaster. You could argue that Fong Long's true life story was in fact the entire basis for how the Rose character survives the movie. In real life, it wasn't Rose DeWitt Bukater hanging off that wooden door panel in the freezing North Atlantic. It was Fong Long who did that. And the scene in the film showing that wound up on the cutting room floor. You see what's going on here? This is why we have to talk about ethnicity and colonialism in conjunction with the Titanic. The real Fong Long became an American citizen, settled in Wisconsin, and died in 1985. His son, who is still alive, did not even know that his father was a Titanic survivor during the father's lifetime. I've got some sources in the description about Fong Long and his life. The Chinese aboard the Titanic were legally excluded from entering the United States because of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, one of the most racist laws ever passed in America. The Chinese passengers aboard the Titanic sailed from Southampton intending to transfer directly to a ship in New York Harbor that would then take them to Cuba, where apparently they had jobs lined up. Even after the disaster, that's what happened. The rest of the survivors, brought to New York on the Carpathia, went to Ellis Island, but the Chinese survivors had to go directly to their ship. This after the harrowing experience that they'd all been through. Welcome to America. Notably, all the Chinese aboard Titanic were from Hong Kong, a British colony. So in addition to race, we have an added layer of colonialism draped across this story. Let's talk about the various Middle Easterners aboard the Titanic. There were over 100 passengers who claimed citizenship from various parts of the Ottoman Empire. Most of them were Syrians or Lebanese, but there were a handful from Turkey proper. It's actually not entirely clear how many of the passengers were Lebanese versus Arabs versus Turks. It's unclear for a number of reasons. One of them being that the passenger manifests of the time listed many of them erroneously as quote-unquote Syrians, when in fact not all were from Syria. And much of the identification of these passengers has been done on the basis of their names, not all of which were traditional Syrian, Lebanese, or Arabic names. There was a fabulously complex rainbow of nationalities, ethnicities, and religious groups within the Ottoman Empire in 1912, and today in places that used to be part of the Ottoman Empire, which is most of the modern Middle East. So parsing who was who and who was what in terms of ethnicity is a really, really tough exercise. Suffice it to say, there were Arabs among the Titanic's passengers, there were Lebanese and Syrian Christians, and of course there were Muslims. Like the Chinese or other ethnic minorities whose homelands were ruled by somebody else, like the Lithuanians, Croatians, or Estonians, the passengers from Ottoman lands were subjects of a colonialist empire, which was in 1912 in the early stages of collapse. Ethnic and religious conflict was a hallmark of this process of collapse. In 1908, the Ottoman state had been seized by a group of revolutionaries known as the Young Turks, who ushered in a short-lived period of constitutional government in the twilight days of the Ottoman Empire before its final dissolution and the establishment of the Republic of Turkey in 1923. The Young Turk government, which was in charge in 1912 at the time of the Titanic sinking, made one disastrous decision after another. In 1914, for example, they chose to join World War I on the side of the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, which led to widespread warfare within the Middle East itself, including the Arab Revolt of 1916-17, cue Lawrence of Arabia, and the very complicated political and military mess that gave rise to the modern borders and problems of the Middle East. During the war, the Young Turks were also responsible for genocide against the Armenians in 1915. Suffice it to say, there was an incredible amount of ethnic tension and turmoil roiling around in the Ottoman sphere of influence in this era. Those who sailed aboard the Titanic seem to have been trying to migrate to the United States or Canada to escape that sort of tension and turmoil. I haven't even touched on the powder keg of ethnic tension that was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, who had several citizens among Titanic's passengers. When historians talk about the coming of World War I, this is usually cited as a major factor in causing the war. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, after all, was carried out by a Serbian nationalist. One way to think about ethnic conflict and nationalism in this period is that it was kind of like a lot of electric energy, all charged up and flashing around in various parts of the world. The traditional empires and colonialist states tried to keep this energy cooped up inside their borders, kind of like trapping all of that electrical energy in a bottle. Colonialism is the bottle. Now, this isn't a perfect analogy by any means, because ethnic tension and nationalism can't always be contained, and in fact often is really difficult to contain, so imagine a bottle that leaks. And of course, there's the chance, and actually the eventuality, that the bottle will get supercharged and those tensions will cause it to explode. That would certainly happen in the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires during and especially at the end of World War I. But let me posit a theory using the electricity in a bottle as a metaphor. Even the big, supposedly stable empires and colonialist states, namely Britain, the United States, and Russia, were finding it hard to keep all of that electricity of ethnic tension and nationalism under control. A colonialist empire is hard to control. There had been numerous large-scale revolts against British rule in India and the ones in Ireland that I mentioned earlier. In 1912, the United States was only 10 years removed from the end of a brutal colonialist war to subjugate the Philippines, which it took by force from Spain's disintegrating empire in 1898. In Russia, pogroms against Jews in various parts of Russia and Eastern Europe had barely ended. The last large-scale anti-Jewish pogrom was in 1906. The broader point that I'm making here is that there's no way that the Titanic, being an ark of so many different ethnicities and nationalities, could avoid reflecting these tensions that were about to tear the world apart. If the Titanic reflected the centuries-old British-Irish conflict by the way in which it was built and the identities of those who built it, it can't have helped but reflect the broader world of ethnic, nationalist, and colonialist tension that was in 1912 straining the seams of the various big power empires from whose citizens virtually the entire passenger list was drawn. You can't acknowledge there were Chinese from Hong Kong aboard the Titanic without engaging with the reasons why they were there and what happened to them after the disaster. You can't talk about Arabs, Lebanese, or Turks aboard the Titanic, or Croatians, Lithuanians, Poles, Jews, or Irish for that matter, without understanding how they came to be there and what was going on where they came from. These are deeper questions than most Titanic-related media is willing to go into in any sustained way, but they are central to the meaning of the Titanic disaster. I don't think Fong Long's real-life story of how he survived this disaster belongs on the cutting room floor, but the way we usually tell the story and think about it tends to put him and the Lebanese and the Arabs and the Irish Catholics into the fringes and footnotes. Let's get them out of the fringes and footnotes. They are the Titanic story every bit as much as Wallace Hartley and the band are. I'm not going to spend that much time on labor, but it's definitely worth a mention. The subject already came up in the chapter on Ireland when I mentioned that Harland and Wolff, the company that built the Titanic, had a closed shop policy. Their union had a closed shop policy that was discriminatory on religious grounds. This is just one small aspect of the labor problems connected with the disaster. The Titanic was a unique, one-of-a-kind capital asset built to make a profit. It was owned indirectly by J.P. Morgan, one of the richest men in the world in 1912, but that asset was nothing but a hunk of dead iron sitting at the dock without the labor of the people who crewed, maintained, and sailed her, and the labor of a lot of other people in support functions. Case in point, on Saturday, April 6th, 4 days before Titanic sailed from Southampton, a 37-day strike by British coal miners was settled by government action in passing the Coal Mines Act of 1912, the first minimum wage ever established in Britain. There's been a lot of butterfly effect type of speculation about what might have happened if the coal strike hadn't been settled in time for the scheduled sailing. Would the ship have been delayed? If that delay happened, would it have meant that she'd have missed the iceberg? Those sorts of things. This is the kind of speculation best done between bong hits in your college dorm room, but it sort of exists in a vacuum. In the days before the sailing, the White Star Line was doing some frantic shifting around of the coal that it had on hand in Southampton to be able to supply Titanic pending the result of that strike. She probably would have sailed anyway, even if the strike was going on, but the settlement of the strike certainly did remove that as a potential obstacle. The broader point, though, is that organized labor was making its presence felt in Britain, the United States, and other industrialized countries in a huge way in 1912. The nationwide coal strike that almost impacted Titanic sailing was organized by the Miners' Federation of Great Britain, which was established in 1888 and carried on a decades-long struggle for better wages and better working conditions for the miners supplying the basic fuel of Britain's ongoing industrial revolution. Labor unrest had convulsed the big industrial societies numerous times before 1912. In 1894, the Pullman strike brought the economy of the United States to a virtual standstill. The 1912 British coal miners' strike was a sequel to an earlier period of unrest, a series of strikes in 1910, which led to an event called the Tony Pandy riots, where the British Home Secretary sent the regular army to a town in Wales to quell riots between striking miners and police backing strikebreakers who had been sent in. Incidentally, the British Home Secretary who made that decision was none other than Winston Churchill, future hero of World War II. Owners and operators of industrial enterprises hated dealing with organized labor in any way, shape, or form. They still do. Starbucks and Amazon, I'm looking at you. The White Star Line was forced to deal with them, however. On the same day the strike was settled, Saturday, April 6th, the line recruited most of Titanic's crew, which were supplied by two labor unions, the British Seafarers Union and the National Sailors and Firemen's Union. A bit less than a quarter of the crew survived. In addition to the ship's crew, boiler stokers and machinists and guys who worked shoveling coal and that sort of thing, there was the victualling staff, the stewards, waiters, waitresses, clerks, bellhops, cooks, and such. This group was very hard hit. Less than 20% of them survived. There were also independent contractors aboard Titanic, what today we would call gig workers. The three barbers aboard the ship were all self-employed. Only one of them survived. The band that played to the end, very, very famous, all of them were independent contractors. The a la carte restaurant for the first-class passengers was a contracted concession, run by an Italian businessman, Luigi Gatti. Only 3 of the restaurant's 66 staff survived. In fact, there were reports, unconfirmed, that White Star Line stewards literally locked the restaurant staff in their cabins to prevent them from coming up to the lifeboats. That's a rumor, it's not confirmed, but the horrendous death toll among the restaurant staff as compared to other departments of the ship's crew leads me to suspect that it might be true. Can you even imagine the horror of that? Literally locked in your room, you can't get out, water starts gushing in from under the door, and there is nothing you can do about it. These people literally died for their jobs. Just think about that for a minute. At the beginning of the 20th century, laborers all over the world were engaging in a deep and desperate struggle for their livelihoods, dignity, and human rights. A struggle which started long before the Titanic and went on long after it. But this struggle played out aboard the ship down to the final minutes of the disaster. In her book, The Proud Tower, which I'm going to go into in just a minute, historian Barbara Tuchman spends a lot of time talking about the rise of labor in Western industrial economies in the years before World War I. So clearly, this was a vitally important aspect of what was going on at the time. If you like what I'm doing here, don't just subscribe. Of course, it'd be great if you did that, but it'd be very helpful for you to click on one of my other videos. I have several on other ocean liners or nautical topics, none as long or as in-depth as this one, and I also have videos on various other historical subjects. I'm primarily a historian, but I'm also an author and teacher. I teach history courses online at my website, seanmunger.com. I've got several books available on Amazon, including a crime thriller, In Deadly Mirrors. The sequel to that one is coming out soon. And I also have a science fiction book, The Valley of Forever. I have a Patreon, that's patreon.com/seanmunger, or you can donate to my Ko-Fi. The link is in the description to this video. I'll also put a link to my Substack blog, seanmungerhistory.substack.com. I write about world problems from a historical standpoint. Thank you so much for your support. Sorry to interrupt the flow. Let's get back to the meaning of the Titanic. Now, at last, we're getting to the essence of my broader argument. Bear with me here. Before the break, I left off with mention of the Proud Tower, so let's talk about that now. The Proud Tower was a book published in 1966, written by Barbara Tuchman, an extraordinarily influential historian, even though she was not professionally trained. This book was her next one after she hit it big with The Guns of August, published in 1962, about the July crisis and the opening military moves of World War I. The title refers to August 1914, the month the war began, at least as between Britain and Germany. This book, The Guns of August, absolutely terrific book, and it was made famous by President John F. Kennedy, who during the tense days of the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 remarked that he wished his own military commanders had read that book so that they would understand how nations blunder into disastrous wars when the leaders think they're in control and making such smart decisions. Anyway, The Proud Tower was a series of essays on European society in the decades before World War I, roughly from 1870, the time of the Franco-Prussian War, to 1914. Tuchman spends a lot of time talking about aristocrats and patricians, anarchists and socialists, the Dreyfus Affair in France in the 1890s, and the rise of organized labor. But what she does, her real gift as a historian, was to capture the cultural and psychological mood of the whole age. Even the title of the book, The Proud Tower, refers to it. Europeans before 1914 were proud, and they thought their civilization towered over all others, partly because of technology, partly because of what they perceived as their cultural superiority, and partly because they were the beneficiaries of the labor and resources flowing into their empires from various parts of the globe. This became a self-reinforcing concept because they had mastery over so much of the world and its resources. Supposedly that proved that they deserved that mastery and that the order they lived in was a just one. Needless to say, World War I destroyed the Proud Tower. Not just because of the ugliness, savagery, and destruction, millions of guys getting chewed into sausage by machine gun bullets and barbed wire, but the laying bare of the exceptionally ugly and thuggish world order that these societies had built for themselves. Example, during World War I, hundreds of thousands of men from far-flung parts of European empires, India, Indochina, French West Africa, and such, they were given uniforms, herded onto steamships, and ferried halfway across the globe to fight and die in the muddy trenches of the European war. The conditions of those voyages were very much like slave ships coming out of Africa in the 15th through 19th centuries. This experience rightfully made many people in those colonialist empires question the world order that caused this catastrophe. This was Western civilization? This was the Proud Tower? This was what Europeans were killing literally millions of people in order to preserve? Now, Tuchman doesn't make this argument specifically. She doesn't have to. Before we pick up the book, we know exactly how it's going to end. But she does shine an uncomfortable light on the society that existed before the war, the society that gave us the Titanic. Now, this is a quote from Barbara Tuchman herself. Quote, "The period was not a golden age or belle epoque, except to a thin crust of the privileged class. It was not a time exclusively of confidence, innocence, comfort, stability, security, and peace. Our misconception lies in assuming that doubt and fear, ferment, protest, violence, and hate were not equally present. We have been misled by the people of the time themselves, who, looking back across the gulf of the war, see that the earlier half of their lives was misted over by a lovely sunset haze of peace and security. It did not seem so golden when they were in the midst of it." End quote. Notably, and you may find this astonishing, I did, Barbara Tuchman doesn't mention the Titanic once in The Proud Tower. I think she should have. What better symbol could there be of the cultural and psychological shock that the coming of World War I eventually was to have on the Proud Tower society? You build the grandest ocean liner in the world, owned indirectly, I remind you again, by one of the richest men in the world. You deck it out with as much luxury as you can cram aboard her. You invite some of the finest people. You make a big ballyhoo in the press over it. And then this is what happens to it. And beneath the surface of that grand, beautiful ocean liner, underneath the paneling and the filigree and the frosted glass and the white linen jackets, the ship is a barely held together bottle of ethnic, racial, gender, and religious tensions, labor unrest, exploitation, politics, greed, a microcosm of the Proud Tower society, undone by a totally accidental collision with one of the simplest objects on Earth, a block of frozen water. So do you see this? This is what the Proud Tower teaches us. Society is extraordinarily fragile. Our civilization, such as it is, rests on the slenderest and most rickety foundations. Look how easily the world economy was utterly wrecked back in 2008 when the subprime mortgage bubble burst. No controls, no brakes, no wise men in paneled rooms making wise decisions, even if that's what they thought they were doing. Instead, a panic, cascading failure, millions out of work, neighborhoods shot up in weeds, billion-dollar skyscrapers left unfinished, a whole new crop of economic winners and losers. Look how a tiny organism, a virus, altered the course of world history in the year 2020. How fragile is our world that it can be completely scrambled by that? We have no idea what the ultimate fallout from the coronavirus pandemic will be. And climate change, the biggest civilization scrambler in the history of the world, is now rapidly following that act. We have no idea what we're in for. The Titanic disaster is a textbook case of how this kind of thing works. That is its meaning. Shame on you, Barbara Tuchman, for leaving it out. But with that caveat aside, I highly recommend that you read The Proud Tower and read The Guns of August while you're at it. For the record, Barbara Tuchman is no longer with us. She died in 1989. Coincidentally, she was born in 1912, the year the Titanic went down. The Titanic, though, is not just a reflection or demonstrative example, which is the point that I was making with the Proud Tower. The central argument is that it was a quiver. Now remember how I defined quiver. Quiver, as I mean that term, is an event that discloses unexpected weakness or potential breakdown in a system or an institution that was previously assumed to be indefinitely stable. Now, I recognize this concept definitely has some inherent problems. Who's doing the assuming? People in general. Well, how do we define that? There's always somebody out there warning that the sky is about to fall. People are not monolithic. And what does previously assumed mean? There are no specific definitions of these terms, and for that reason, I realize that my quiver theory is a bit mushy, perhaps even pseudo-historical. It can't be falsified or proven empirically. I know that. But is it worth discussing? Obviously, I think it is, or I wouldn't be wasting your time with this very long video. Trust me, there are plenty of theories in mainstream and professional history that are as rife with problems as this one is, so I'm not really going out on as much of a limb as you might think. So, acknowledging the obvious problems with quiver theory, let's get into it. I described quivers as sort of being like foreshocks of an earthquake. In this case, the earthquake was obviously World War I. However, I mean World War I in a very broad sense, not just the military conflict between 1914 and 1918, but the whole societal upheaval that occurred in and around those years. During this brief window of time, several of Europe's major royal dynasties were overthrown and replaced, and the entire world order was remade. And socially and psychologically, World War I was a seismic shift in the world. It was shocking to the conscience and self-image of Western society. How could our supposedly advanced and superior civilization degenerate into such incredible savagery and destruction? How could advanced modern diplomacy, politics, economics, or systems of thought produce the horrors of the trenches, the Lusitania, bombing civilian populations from the sky, and the Red Terror after the Russian Revolution, and so many other examples of the breakdown of orderly society? So quivers, as I define them, are not always the same thing as antecedents. In the years leading up to the outbreak of the war, there were various diplomatic incidents and war scares where it looked like large-scale conflict between European empires might break out. For instance, the Agadir crisis of 1911 or the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913. These were events leading up to World War I, of course, and they did show the instability and weakness in systems previously assumed to be indefinitely stable, European diplomacy, for example. But a quiver, under my definition, does not have to involve any of the exact issues that eventually gave rise to the war. No one can argue that the Titanic was related directly to the causes of World War I, not in the same way that the Agadir crisis was. So, you see the difference? One of the systems previously assumed to be indefinitely stable in the case of the Titanic was Western society's faith in technology and engineering as a force for progress. I termed that the cult of technology. This doesn't even really depend on whether the public literally believed that the Titanic was practically unsinkable before the disaster. Just the fact that the disaster happened, and the way it did, undermined that confidence in technological progress in an eerily similar way to how the war itself eventually would. Example, poison gas, which was first deployed on the Western Front in 1915 by the Germans. Weapons derived from industrial chemical processes were a brand new thing in the war and a truly terrible thing. Chemical warfare in World War I was utterly horrendous. It was thought to be so inhuman that after the war there were attempts, at least partially successful, to ban chemical weapons. This is one of the reasons why Saddam Hussein, the dictator of Iraq, was thought to be beyond the pale when he used mustard gas against his own populations in 1988. But think about this philosophically. How did the same industrial, capitalist, and supposedly advanced Western European civilizations go from celebrating technology as the bleeding edge of progress, as we saw with the Crystal Palace exhibition, to deploying that same technology to figure out how to murder people in greater numbers and even more hideous ways? There is a straight line between the Crystal Palace and mustard gas, or tanks, or Zeppelin bombers, or whatever other mechanized nightmare that you want to pull out of World War I. The Titanic, a technological innovation whose failure caused the deaths of 2/3 of the people aboard her, lies along that exact same straight line. To make this same argument in a slightly different way, consider this. In 1851, when the Crystal Palace exhibition happened, no one but perhaps a tiny few who celebrated that technological progress could yet imagine that a machine might someday be invented that could destroy human civilization. In 1945, not yet a century later, exactly such a machine was invented and was used on at least a small scale. By the Cold War, we, humanity, had to think up new ways to try to prevent ourselves from using the dreadful technologies that we'd invented. This is why we came up with nuclear test ban and ABM treaties, the United Nations, various scientists' organizations lobbying for disarmament, the nuclear freeze movement, those sorts of things. The idea of developing a technology and then using it was so hardwired into our psyches that trying to restrain ourselves from using nuclear weapons was extraordinarily difficult. Now, to be sure, society's general feelings about technology weren't monolithic. A few voices dared to question whether faith in technology was necessarily a good thing. One of them was Mary Shelley, whose 1818 novel Frankenstein raised philosophical questions about the ethical limits of medical science. If we could create life, should we? Another was historian Henry Adams, grandson of President John Quincy Adams. During the Civil War, after hearing about the famous naval duel between ironclads Merrimack and Monitor, which occurred in 1862, he wrote, quote, "Man has mounted science and has now run away with. I firmly believe that before many centuries more, science will be the master of man. The engines he will have invented will be beyond his strength to control. Someday, science may have the existence of mankind in its power, and the human race commit suicide by blowing up the world." End quote. Another famous example, at least famous among Titanic buffs, was author Morgan Robertson, whose 1898 novel The Wreck of the Titan eerily presaged the real-life Titanic disaster. Robertson is famous mainly because of the Gene Dixon effect. The details of his fictional shipwreck coincidentally matched the real disaster so closely, not so much because he was making a broader philosophical point about the dangers of technology, but admittedly you can read that subtext into the wreck of the Titan. If you can read it, it's rather clumsily written. So there were people out there questioning technology, but these kinds of views were generally outliers. In the decades before World War I, the Proud Tower years, faith in technology as a symbol of progress was well embedded in the popular consciousness. Technological progress, a system previously thought to be indefinitely stable, to deliver wonder after wonder that would make everything faster, cleaner, safer, and more profitable, that order stumbled when the Titanic demonstrated the inevitable limits of that approach. The Titanic was not the only quiver leading up to the catastrophe of World War I, the collapse of numerous systems in place in Western society that were assumed previously to be indefinitely stable. In fact, there were several quivers in the years before the war, reflecting political, economic, social, and cultural fault lines that would break open when the war finally came in July and August 1914. I would certainly classify the Panic of 1907 as a quiver. This was a financial crisis that occurred mainly in New York beginning in October 1907. It started with two enterprising businessmen, the Heinz brothers, who tried to corner the market on the stock of the United Copper Company. The corner scheme was financed by several New York banks, including the Knickerbocker Trust Company. The scheme failed. The Heinzes did not corner the market, but the panic on Wall Street triggered runs on the banks that had lent them money. A cascading failure resulted, similar in some ways to the economic collapse of 2008 that started the Great Recession. The U.S. had no central bank at that time, no lender of last resort. The Federal Reserve didn't exist yet. And so a mega-rich private financier had to step in and bail out the failing banks before the entire economy collapsed. The white knight who did that was none other than J.P. Morgan, whose company later owned the Titanic. Morgan and some quick thinking by Treasury Secretary George Cortelyou and President Theodore Roosevelt managed to save the economy, barely, but the incident sent shockwaves through the country and eventually spurred creation of the Federal Reserve System in 1913. The Panic of 1907 exposed just how flimsy and fragile the American economic system was. There had been panics before, of course, and there would be again, but who could have imagined that a crazy scheme by two guys to corner the copper market would torch the entire economy of the United States or come close to it? It did, though. So a quiver is an event that shows unexpected weakness or potential breakdown in a system previously assumed by many people to be indefinitely stable. I think the Panic of 1907 is definitely an example. The U.S. economy did not collapse during World War I, but the global economy was interconnected to a large degree, and the economic shockwaves of the war were immense, impoverishing many, greatly enriching a few, but the war was certainly an economic upheaval as much as a political and military one. Let's take another quiver, the Russian Revolution of 1905. Russia's autocratic form of government had been decaying for most of the 19th century, and late Imperial Russia was a mess. Russia's disastrous war with Japan, which it lost, translated into shortages and privations in the cities, and strikes over economic and political conditions led to the demonstration in St. Petersburg on January 22, 1905, where the troops of Tsar Nicholas II mowed down at least 500 people. Bloody Sunday, it's called. This led to a series of strikes and demonstrations across Russia, including the famous mutiny aboard the battleship Potemkin, the subject of a famous 1920s silent movie. Ultimately, the Tsar was forced to grant some political concessions, such as a parliament. The 1905 revolution is considered by historians a dress rehearsal for the 1917 revolutions, plural, there were two, that ultimately resulted in the Bolshevik takeover and the eventual foundation of the Soviet Union. Keen political observers probably could have told you in 1905 that the Russian monarchy was shaky, but it was hard to imagine at that time that it could have been totally swept away. After all, the Romanovs had been on the throne for nearly 300 years by that point. And the revolution that came was so totally top to bottom that it completely changed Russia's social system and economy as well as its government. So with the hindsight of history, it's easy to see how the Romanovs were riding a bullet train toward oblivion. But again, from the standpoint of 1905, imagine the shockwaves that this revolution caused and the weakness that it illustrated. Again, an event that shows unexpected weakness or potential collapse of a system previously believed to be indefinitely stable. Quivers don't have to be political or economic in nature, and as I said earlier, they don't have to be related at all to the causes of World War I. A great example of another quiver is Igor Stravinsky's famous ballet, The Rite of Spring, and especially the reaction to it. Stravinsky, a Russian and French composer who lived in Switzerland, was a bit of a boy genius. In 1910, his composition The Firebird, first performed in Paris, caused a sensation. But The Rite of Spring, which he began writing in 1911, rocked the world of music to its foundation. A raw, cacophonous piece of music full of primal passions inspired by pagan rituals. No one had ever heard anything like it. It was first performed at the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées in Paris on May 29, 1913, about a year after the Titanic went down and 14 months before the outbreak of World War I. The ballet that accompanied it was equally provocative, based on the idea of a girl dancing herself to death to appease pagan gods. The Rite of Spring outraged and shocked the conservative Paris audience that it was shown to that night. Exactly what happened in the theater is somewhat disputed and probably exaggerated, although it's gone down in history as a riot or near riot. It probably wasn't that, but there were clearly some violent and exuberant reactions. Stravinsky had broken most of the traditional conventions of European music. The Rite of Spring was absolutely groundbreaking in setting the tone for classical music in the 20th century, and it represented a radical break from the past. If you're a Star Trek fan, you're probably really familiar with The Rite of Spring, possibly without knowing it. Television composer Gerald Fried wrote some music for the Star Trek episode Amok Time that was a pretty direct and literal homage to The Rite of Spring, and its presence underlying a fight scene is how it came to be known colloquially as the Star Trek fight music. Fried wrote it in 1967, more than 50 years after Stravinsky's original. That's how influential and revolutionary The Rite of Spring was. So is this a quiver? Well, I think so. The system that was about to collapse was the tradition of classical music, which, like the proud tower society that it came out of, reflected a lot of genteel, mostly Victorian traditions. It's not surprising that the harsh, atonal classical music of the 20th century reflected the violence and upheaval of that century, especially the world wars. But Stravinsky foreshadowed that change more than a year before the First World War broke out. I'm a historian, and as such, I'm supposed to stick to what I can prove with historical evidence. In that sense, my quiver theory is kind of out there. I recognize that. But I'm going to go a little farther out on the limb here and talk about something I can't prove. If you aren't convinced, I don't blame you. Maybe you could at least kind of file this in the food for thought category. Carl Jung was a Swiss psychologist, the founder of the field of analytical psychology, and the formative years of his work were just before World War I. The field of psychology as we now know it was in its infancy in the early 20th century, and it was shaped largely by Jung and his Austrian counterpart and eventual rival, Sigmund Freud. Now, I know that the theories of both of these guys are almost totally discredited within the modern discipline of psychiatry, and I'm not going to argue that Freudian or Jungian concepts have any substantive validity within that field. That's not the purpose of bringing up Jung. Jung is perhaps better thought of more as a philosopher than a scientist, but he did come up with a fascinating concept, the idea of the collective unconscious. According to Jung, who first used the term in 1916 during World War I, Humans have sort of an unconscious mind all in common with one another, and certain ideas or archetypes can come out of that collective unconscious and manifest themselves as ideas in the individual conscious mind. Supposedly, this is why myths and stories across various cultures and time periods of human history have remarkable similarities. The hero's journey, explicated by Joseph Campbell in 1949, is something that you could argue is in the collective unconscious. If you've seen Star Wars or The Hunger Games, you know what the hero's journey is. The existence of a collective unconscious cannot be proven empirically. It just can't. But if there is something to that concept, it stands to reason that humanity's collective unconscious suffered a collective psychological and spiritual shock at the time of World War I, which was then literally the worst thing that had ever happened, and which profoundly shocked and disillusioned millions of people around the world. If you buy into that concept, or are at least willing to entertain it, is it so far a jump to suggest that perhaps in the same way there are quivers that function as foreshocks of a coming historical upheaval, there might also have been foreshocks of that injury, that trauma to the world's collective unconscious? In other words, quivers of the unconscious mind. Now, this is far-fetched, I grant you, but I've spent some time thinking about it. Could there have been somebody out there, some evidence we can find in the years before World War I, where somebody might have manifested this kind of unconscious or psychological quiver in some way that makes sense in hindsight? Turns out there is. In 1912, a painter named Ludwig Meidner, who lived in Berlin, began working on a series of paintings called the apocalyptic landscapes. Meidner was known as an expressionist, but these pictures were radically different than what he'd been doing before. They depicted destruction and suffering on a vast and ugly scale. They showed cities burning, heaps of human bodies, explosions, desolation, visions of an apocalypse. According to his own account, he made these paintings in a trance-like state. Many of these pictures eerily resembled impressionistic art that would later be made, particularly by German expressionists, depicting the destruction of the war itself. Trenches, barbed wire, bodies, all the nightmares of World War I, but Meidner made his paintings before the war began. Was he somehow channeling the destruction of the war, and particularly its visual and artistic dimensions, in the years before it started? Maybe it's a complete coincidence. In fact, it probably is. But Meidner is mentioned, quite curiously, by a couple of historical sources in connection with the coming of World War I. If you believe in a collective unconscious, and if you think that perhaps that unconscious could somehow have foreshadowed the trauma that was coming, you could conceivably speculate that Ludwig Meidner's apocalyptic landscapes are sort of a quiver, but a quiver happening on a subconscious and philosophical level. If you're willing to grant that possibility, then what do you make of this? Carl Jung himself seems to have suffered some sort of mental breakdown in 1913, about the same time that he and Freud became professional and personal enemies. Beginning in November 1913, at night, Jung began exploring visions that came out of his subconscious mind and writing them down and sketching them. These visions were bizarre and violent, full of strange monsters and weird psychic journeys. Jung himself said that he was on the verge of a psychosis in this period. He began his weird diary 8 months before World War I began, but when the war came, he recognized that the visions he'd been having were relevant to the cultural moment that was then going on. He completed his diary during the war, and the book that eventually came out of this, the Red Book or Liber Novus, was not published until 2009. Now, I've read this book. The 2009 edition included his pictures, at least in tone, they are not dissimilar from the apocalyptic visions of Ludwig Meidner, at least in what they make you think about. The Red Book is absolutely insane. I highly recommend it. It's really interesting. But could it also be a quiver or close to one? Now, I preface this by saying that I was going out on a limb. Clearly, not everybody in the world who had strange visions in 1913 was channeling World War I. This may be a completely crackpot theory, but hey, there's a lot wilder stuff on YouTube, and I doubt that you could have expected that I could connect something as esoteric as Jung's Red Book to the Titanic. The Titanic may be relevant as an example to something else, something very topical. It's not just ancient history 110 years in the past. As a historian and one who has studied events of societal collapse, especially the coming of World War I believe the signs are pretty clear that our own global civilization is on the brink of a similar period of upheaval and potential collapse. Climate change is the main driver of this. Global warming, caused mainly by human activity in the form of carbon emissions from the burning of fossil fuels, is already wreaking havoc on our society. Heat waves and other extreme weather events, droughts and food insecurity, sea level rise, economic shocks, political and military conflicts. It's already happening. And it's going to accelerate because we have done nothing substantive about climate change. A new wave of global upheaval and instability was predicted a generation ago. In this book, The Future in Plain Sight by Eugene Linden, published in 1998, and many of its predictions have already come true. So if we are headed for a global catastrophe, comparable at least in magnitude to World War I, if not in its exact parameters, and if we can recognize quivers that preceded that catastrophe, like the Titanic disaster, it stands to reason that we should be seeing events in the recent past that in hindsight may be identifiable as quivers. The tricky thing about quivers is that they're recognizable mostly in hindsight. They're not necessarily predictive. But if you asked me the question, are there recent events that might have the characteristics of quivers, disclosing unexpected weakness or potential breakdown in systems previously assumed to be indefinitely stable? Are there these things looking toward a future societal collapse? This is largely a guessing game, but I think yes. Brexit seems to me to be like a quiver. Brexit, of course, is the process by which the UK left the European Union. What was the system previously assumed to be indefinitely stable that Brexit showed the weakness of? It was nothing less than the entire post-World War II international order, which had been engineered, at least to the extent that it could be, by the winning powers of that war, especially the US and the countries of Western Europe, so as to prevent another world war. Brexit represents a retreat from whatever spirit of international cooperation, at least among Western European countries, existed after World War II. The NATO alliance is right now being similarly strained. We're witnessing the results of the weakening of international cooperation, Russia's war of conquest against Ukraine. Vladimir Putin desperately wanted the UK to vote leave in Brexit because he knew it would ultimately inure to his benefit, and it did. I should add that Brexit is itself connected to climate change. The civil war in Syria that began in the middle of the 2000s has been linked to human-caused climate change. The Syrian civil war was part of a chain of events that sparked a refugee crisis in the Middle East and Europe, to which the Leave campaign in the UK in 2016 was in part a backlash. This kind of thing, incidentally, was predicted in Eugene Linden's book, The Future in Plain Sight, the rise of xenophobic and anti-immigrant politics as Western democracies fall under increasing economic, environmental, and political stress. I think you could argue that the COVID-19 pandemic is also a quiver. Medical science has advanced tremendously in the past few decades. Scientists are making significant inroads against HIV/AIDS, against various forms of cancer and infectious diseases. Yet the entire world was disrupted by a major global pandemic, in which the networks that were supposed to manage large-scale health crises broke down, even in many advanced countries. These are just two potential examples. As I said, you can't really recognize a quiver or predict what kind of shock that it's foreshadowing in a forward-looking direction. I offer this as kind of a food for thought type of suggestion. You may remember that in the chapter on the Titanic as industrial technology, I referred to a societal cult of technology. The idea in many people's minds that technology was always, or at least usually, a force for good in the world, a marker of progress with a capital P, and a justification for colonialism. One of the reasons the Titanic disaster resonates is because it went against this orthodoxy. It was shocking to the cult of technology. Big, perfectly engineered, practically unsinkable machines weren't supposed to kill people on a mass scale. In our modern world, I would argue that we've rebuilt this cult of technology, and unlike the people who lived in the Proud Tower era before World War I, we have no excuse to be duped. The people who streamed into the Crystal Palace in 1851 to gawk at the wonders of technology and modern machinery couldn't quite imagine that someday a machine would be invented that could destroy the world. I made that point earlier. But we can imagine that, and yet our faith in technology rivals theirs. In the last 30 years, our lives and our world have been revolutionized by technology. The internet, cell phones, and social media have changed the way we live, work, and relate to one another. We instinctively want and expect things to advance rapidly. We want next year's iPhone because it will be better and faster than last year's. We think we'll get rich on the next tech-related financial boom because we know instinctively that people fundamentally expect technology to advance and enhance itself. We also expect, for the most part, our future to be marked, as our recent past has been, by technological advancement. In the early and middle part of the 20th century, science fiction writers' conceptions of the future almost always revolved around technology. From Fritz Lang's 1927 film Metropolis to the 1960s cartoon sitcom The Jetsons, which played on cliches of bubble cities and flying cars. What if that's not our future, though? As the Titanic demonstrated, technological advancement comes at a high cost. Behind our iPhones and streaming services are vast amounts of resources, natural and financial, and armies of workers carrying out labor that's often dangerous and poorly compensated. If you study climate change for even a short time, it becomes clear that technological advancement, as we've grown used to it and expect it to continue, is fundamentally unsustainable. Given the problems of global warming and the rapid exhaustion of resources on our planet, it seems clear to me that our future as a society is not high-tech, but low-tech. Far from looking like Fritz Lang or the Jetsons, the cities of the future may be horse-drawn and candle-lit. That won't be by choice, but a casualty of the process of how we get there will necessarily be an abandonment of the cult of technology as we now know it. If the Titanic means anything, it shows that a belief in technology as never-ending forward progress is a fallacy. The Titanic is not the first or only lesson on that topic. You can find the same lesson in the trenches of the Western Front, the gas chambers of Auschwitz, or the ruined streets of Hiroshima in 1945. Our society seems particularly resistant to learning this lesson, which means that it will be taught to us again in some equally nightmarish way. I realize that I've gone in many different directions in this video, and I've gone places that you would probably never have expected me to go when I started with the Titanic, but I do like to consider the broad strokes the big picture version of history. The Titanic is a subject that traditionally lends itself to technical minutiae, unconnected to any sort of big picture. So my purpose in this video is to try to connect it back up to the big picture if it was ever connected. So to sum up, the main point I'm making here is that the Titanic was a quiver, an event that disclosed unexpected weakness or potential collapse in a system that was previously assumed to be indefinitely stable, in advance of a period of major societal upheaval, the World War I era. The Titanic disaster was shocking because it shook people's faith in the superiority of technology and engineering. It was exactly that same loss of faith on a large scale 2 or so years later that made World War I such a terrible shock to the collective psyche of Western civilization. Quivers are not necessarily related to the causes of a coming shock. The Titanic disaster has nothing specific to do with European alliances, military competition, or other traditionally asserted causes of the First World War. Yet, even in acknowledging that, we can't get away from the role some of the conditions that gave rise to World War I played in the disaster itself. This is why I talked about sectarian conflict in Ireland, class and gender issues, colonialism and ethnicity, and labor. All of these were factors that helped make the Titanic disaster ultimately what it was, and they're the key to understanding and appreciating its meaning. But this is also broader than just the dry historical factors. The meaning of the Titanic has something in common with much more humanistic and philosophical factors, which is why I think it's interesting to think about it in conjunction with the apocalyptic landscapes of Ludwig Meidner or Carl Jung's collective unconscious philosophies, and how he sought to explore them in the mental journeys that ultimately comprised his Red Book. Historians generally don't think this way. For this reason, they haven't been too interested in trying to parse the broader meaning of this event. I'm hoping that I've illuminated perhaps an angle on the subject of the Titanic that not too many people really have spent a lot of time thinking about. The Titanic disaster does have a meaning, a historical event that has generated so much interest, so much fascination for 110 years has to have a meaning. This has been my attempt to try to articulate what I think it might be. In my opinion, one of the most haunting aspects of the Titanic disaster is what happened on Saturday, April 20th, 1912, 5 days after the ship disappeared beneath the waves. The White Star Line, reeling from the disaster, chartered the cable-laying ship Mackay Bennett, based out of Halifax, to sail out to the position where the Titanic went down and recover any human remains that might be found there. The ship carried 100 coffins and 40 embalmers who had been recruited for the voyage. Mackay Bennett arrived at the site about 6 a.m. on Saturday morning, April 20th. Sure enough, they found bodies all over the place. Titanic's passengers and crew still floating in their life jackets. Mackay Bennett recovered 328 corpses, of which 119, incapable of being identified, were sewn up in weighted canvas bags and buried at sea. Ironically, even in death, Titanic's class system was rigidly maintained. The bodies of first-class passengers got dibs on the coffins, second class got wrapped in canvas and stored in the hold, and third class buried at sea. It's hard to imagine what a sad and grisly job this must have been. Mackay Bennett spent a couple of days trolling around the area looking for bodies and finally set back out for Halifax on April 26th. The same day that she arrived on the site, though, another North Atlantic passenger liner, the Bremen, not the famous superliner, which hadn't been built yet, but an earlier one, the Bremen sailed through the area of the sinking. Passengers on the deck of the Bremen saw floating bodies all over the sea. One woman described seeing the bodies of 3 men all clutching different parts of the same floating deck chair. She also saw a woman fully dressed holding a dead St. Bernard. How utterly heartbreaking this all must have been. It's easy to get lost in all the little tiny wormholes of the subject of the Titanic. You can obsess over steel and rivets and what happened when the stern section sank, and you can even go hog wild with grand historical theories about what it all means. It's easy to do all of that. It's harder to remember sometimes that this disaster had an immense human cost. These were real people, each one with a life story that ended abruptly when the ship went down. James Cameron thoughtfully reminded everyone of this in the 1997 movie. He gives treasure hunter Brock Lovett a line toward the end, "I never got it, I never let it in." Part of the meaning of the Titanic is appreciating its human scale and the emotional and personal toll that this sort of disaster took. So, putting aside all the broad strokes of history, let me say unequivocally that that is also the meaning of the Titanic. Thank you for sticking with me for this very long video. Thank you, and take care.